I want to do a book review on Leadership is Language, the Hidden Power of What You Say and What You Don't by Captain David Marquet, US Navy retired. David, I was honored to have as a guest on the podcast because I love two of his books, which have made a profound difference to many of the businesses I work with. And of all the various books I've read recently, these are two favorites. The first one is Turn the Ship Around, where he took the worst damn ship in the US Navy, a submarine, the USS Santa Fe, which he was laughing about how bad it was and how bad morale was. And he thought he was going to the USS Olympia, and he trained for a year reading all the books and all the manuals about it. And then someone with a sense of humor in the US Navy found that the captain of the Santa Fe had just been fired, and he put Captain David Marquet as the captain of that ship. So having learned all about one submarine, he now, and thought he knew it all, he found he had just weeks to take over another submarine, which he knew nothing about. He hadn't read all the books and didn't know where all the valves were and what every role was. And so he was forced to, rather than be the expert, to actually rely on the power of the people on the submarine, the experts themselves who knew more about it than he did. This is where these two books came from. Really interesting manner. So, Leadership is Language, which is the second book. I've picked out 10 themes that I found very interesting. I'll expand on each of those. The first one is embrace we language. He wants to get this sense of collective responsibility rather than it being one great leader, you the CEO or you the person in charge of your department. You want this sense of collective responsibilities by saying we. So we have in NLP, if you've come across neuro-linguistic programming, I was lucky enough to work with a couple of the founders of NLP, did a long 7-day course. It was very intense, a lot of fun, completely nuts at time. But the whole point of NLP, which can be used for heavy sales techniques, but actually some of the stuff is really very good, such as this idea that words create worlds. So if you use martial, military, attack, defend, fight, overcome, assault, it tends to create a whole philosophy, a culture linked to the language. So as the boss of your bit of the business, be very careful in the language that you use, what you say and what you don't say. So we language, when you say we, you can create this sense of team culture where everybody feels valued and engaged, rather than the big I am. And we've seen many politicians, goodness, I don't need to name too many of them around the world, but in the age of the strong man, whether it be Trump or Bolsonaro in Brazil or Xi Jinping in China, or we had Boris and Liz Trump in England, they wanted Erdogan in Turkey and the Philippines as well, and you can go around the world. They wanted to be the big macho leader, the strong person, the strong man, the strong woman leader. And it's all about I and me. It's all the spotlight is on them. That doesn't really create a sense of collective responsibility. People think they want the strong leader, but actually they want leaders who are going to empower and elevate rather than control and push everything, so that everybody has to check in with them, which is on to the next topic. Give control, create leaders. He has this lovely saying, David Marquet, take control, create followers. Give control, create leaders. So moving away from this traditional top-down leadership style, and he's got a lovely video, well worth watching, 9 minutes long, called Greatness by David Marquet on YouTube, where they've got a graphic speed drawer as he's talking it through, and he said, you know, like Russell Crowe and ahead, full steam, you know, 1 degree right, aye, aye, Captain, all doing, aye, aye, Captain, yes, you know, everything he says, the captain says, the captain thinks, and they all respond to it. So he's the one person thinking, and he's got 136 people who are waiting for his orders and his command. So go away from that traditional top-down leadership, and by giving people control over their work, you can inspire those people to become leaders themselves. It's almost like in PwC, I had a very good partner who wrote a book, and it was called Leaders Growing Leaders. This idea that if you empower and you elevate, they will step into the role. This idea of find a second in command at every level and every post. The military did this brilliantly. And I think back to my days when we were live firing, and then we were also doing simulated laser battles with a live enemy, but we were firing blank rounds, but we were firing lasers, which could go up to 2 kilometers at other tanks. And I had 14 warrior armored infantry fighting vehicles with main armament and machine guns as well, and 8 troops in the back. And depending on what goes on, we could kill people a long way out. But if you elevate people so they think for themselves, if you're there, you can control everything. And I've been in some organizations where the CEO is the smartest man in the room or the smartest woman in the room. Sounds great, and they're brilliant at problem solving. But what if they're not there? And I've seen this happen where they just don't hold the meeting if the CEO isn't there, or the hippo, we call the hippo the highest paid person's opinion. The hippo's not there, or if the hippo speaks first, everybody follows in exactly what they say and they nod. A bit like Kennedy, President Kennedy in the Bay of Pigs fiasco. And this is where Kennedy had an entourage of yes men. I don't think he had any women. I think they're all men. It was very macho male, sort of 60s. And somebody said, Mr. President, you know, I don't think we should send any air power in there because it would make it obvious that it is America getting involved in invading Cuba rather than Cuban exiles. And he went, okay, yeah, that's good. Don't you all agree, everybody? Oh, yes, yes, Mr. President. And there was no naysayers. There was no people who thought for themselves and went, it's crazy. You're going in without air power. And as it was crazy. And the Bay of Pigs was a fiasco because Castro and his troops rounded them up within about 3 hours. It was all over. So giving people control, ownership is really powerful. And this idea of this is my commander's intent. This is what I want to do. What's your intent to achieve my intent? So how can you contribute to that overall intent? And what am I thinking now? Sure. Have I done this? We'll have you. So asking great questions, which I'll come back to later on. But giving control and creating leaders where you have responsibility. Ultimately, the accountability is always going to be you as the senior person. And this is where, particularly in Britain, but certainly in a number of countries, politicians have become very make like a wine bottle, no shoulders at all to take responsibility. And they blame someone else, the civil servants, but they never take personal accountability. When things have gone wrong or they've done things wrong, they don't resign. Whereas in my background of the military, certainly the British military, I can only speak of, when you done something wrong, you had to resign. And if you didn't do it of your own sense of integrity, those who knew you would come to you and say, if you're not embarrassed, I'm embarrassed for you. What are you going to do? You've done wrong. What should you do? Do the right thing. Do the right thing. And they'd resign. But there's a story in that, I'm sure. So creating this cadre of leaders who grow leaders, you empower and you elevate. That's the second one. Give control, create leaders. The third one is ask, don't tell. Ask, don't tell. So often the style is, if I want your opinion, I'll give it to you. Just do this and do this. And then what should I do now? And they come back to you for instructions on what to do now. Well, of course, you're making a rod for your own back if that's your leadership style, because everybody keeps coming back and checking in with you. It might be good for your ego that you feel, oh, great, everybody, they need me. They're coming to me. They want my opinion on something. But you make yourself indispensable, which I've known some leaders like that idea of being indispensable. That's the wrong approach. You should make yourself redundant. So you have got yourself on the balcony. You can see the bigger picture. You've elevated and empowered the leaders you have so that you can take time out for your own health and well-being, but more importantly, to deal with strategic issues. And the board you're dealing with, or the team that you're reporting into, that's your first team. Your own team is your second team. So you can spend more time on the bigger issues for the organization rather than micromanaging and doing people's work for them. So getting away from the tell culture into having some fabulous questions. And one of the leaders I was with, he just passed on to me a whole series of great questions to ask people. But you can almost have your own version of it. I always love questions that I ask CEOs, like, when was the last time you were dead wrong? You personally were really wrong in the decision you made. Now, people fall into a spectrum, as you may imagine. On one end, you've got those with humility and appropriate vulnerability go, do you know what, Jonathan, I make mistakes all the time. I'm learning from them. I hope not to make the same mistake twice, but yeah, yesterday or this morning, I made this mistake and this is how I resolved it. And I apologize and stuff, which goes on to my second point is there's a follow-up question. But before I finish that follow-up question, on this spectrum, on the other end of the spectrum, there are too many, and many are famous political figures that in the world where they go, do you know what? I can't think of a time I was wrong. Liz Truss is one in a atrocious time in power. She's just so arrogant and never admitting mistake. And various people who've left power and they blame everybody else. Fingers are pointing out there, but as you remember, there's three fingers pointing back when you're pointing at other people. These fingers are pointing back at you. That they never accept responsibility. So asking questions rather than issuing directives encourages your team members to think critically and develop solutions. And it fosters this sense of learning and empowerment. So with the CEO's example, the last time you're dead wrong, the second element to that was how quickly did you realize you were wrong? They tell you. And then the third one is, and how quickly did you apologize to everybody affected? Oh, no, never apologize. I mean, sometimes I've heard that. Working with a very big brand, and the CMO I was working with was fabulous, and she had a global CMO, and she apologized to a couple of her staff in a meeting when the global CEO was there because she'd been a bit brusque with them, unnecessarily so, and she was wrong. And she publicly in the group, there's about 10 of them, apologized. And afterwards, the global CMO took her to one side and said, "You should never apologize." And she said, "Oh, yes, I should. If I'm wrong, I should apologize." It sets a good example. And it did. It created a lot more psychological safety, which we'll talk about later on. Point 4, redefine failure. I love this one. Rather than viewing failure as a catastrophe, David Marquet proposes that it should be seen as a learning opportunity, a mindset that promotes experimentation and growth. I call it a teachable moment. When I was working with one of the professors at the University of Michigan, he was calling it a teachable moment. When something has gone wrong, what have you learned and what are you going to do? There's a famous story about John Watson, who'd taken over as CEO at IBM, and I was at IBM, and it's the legend that's still passed on from the 50s, I think it was. And he'd just taken over, and he was day 2, and one of his senior vice presidents came to see him, and he said, sir, I've got a problem. And he said, okay, what's the problem? And he said, the team and I have been able to solve this problem. We've been trying to solve it for about 6 months. We've known about it. But I didn't feel safe enough to talk to your predecessor. He said, well, why is that? He said, well, it was quite a good news culture and failure was not an option. You were not allowed to fail. He said, well, have you worked out the cost of this failure? I mean, how much is it costing us? It said, $250,000. Now, in the 50s, that was a lot of money. So the senior vice president said to John Watson, I suppose you're going to fire me. And John said, fire you? Why would I fire you? I've just invested $250,000 in your development. What have you learned? And what are you going to do? I'd like you to go and have a discussion with your team and come back and tell me what you've learned and what you're going to do, and we'll act on that. Guy did. John gave him the go-ahead to go with their plan. He got them to work on 3 options. Remember, there's always not one option. That's a decision, 3 options, and which one he was prepared to invest his whole career behind in that decision. Not only did they regain that lost money, but they made another $2 million. And he went on to become the CEO after John. Now, clearly making a mistake is not good. If you're making loads of mistakes time after time, fool on you for accepting someone who is constantly incompetent and ineffective. You need to do something with them, to help them find their happiness elsewhere. But redefining failure and having what we would in the military call after-action reviews, what worked well, what would make it even better if, WWW, EBI, and what Marshall Goldsmith taught me, one of the top coaches in the world, was GDD. What was good? What did you find difficult? And what should we do differently? Good, difficult, differently, GDD. So a good way of doing it. But whatever you do, an after-event, after-action review. So redefine failure. See, it's a learning opportunity, an organization with a culture of learning and action and teachable moments. Number 5, use short-term goals to foster long-term vision. David argues that focusing on short-term goals can actually undermine the long-term vision. Instead, he suggests framing daily actions in terms of their contribution to the larger vision. So this idea of commander's intent, what would a successful team be like 3 years from now? If we've been hugely successful, what would we be like? What would we have achieved? And you can even do, if you want, there's postmortems, looking at after the situation, after action reviews. There's pre-mortems where you go, it's now 3 years on, and let's say it didn't work. What went wrong that it didn't work? It was beyond time, cost, and budget. And therefore, knowing that was what potentially didn't work, what mitigating actions can we take now to ensure that doesn't come to pass in 3 years' time? So use the short-term goals to foster the long-term vision. You don't want to have just achieving small goals without it being part of the overall commander's intent. And in the military, we always had this mission analysis. What's my mission? What's the commander 2 levels up want? What does the commander 1 level up want? What's my part in their plan? Number 6 is respect expertise. I've come across some leaders who, and more than I'd care to mention, who want to be the smartest man in the room, the most knowledgeable, that they expect you to know everything about your business, absolutely everything about your ship, from each widget to gas pressures and things like that. But that's a mistake, in my opinion. You want to be surrounded by an army of metaphorical giants, men and women who are 2 inches taller than you in their expertise area. They're specialists, because that way you never work a day in your life, because you've got all these specialists who can help you and advise you. But ultimately, of course, you're in the business of decision evaluation, not decision making. Decision making should be done at the lowest possible level. The evaluation, once a week, once a month, where you look back over the decisions that were made, are they still relevant? Were they the right decisions? In light of what we now know, would we still do that? There's a lovely time. Churchill has many flaws, Winston Spencer Churchill. One of his failures was he did tend to flip-flop he changed political parties about 3 times. He made some terrible mistakes with decisions about the Dardanelles and that kind of stuff. And was in the out of favor for many years. But he'd changed his opinion on something, and a member of the opposite party was criticizing him. And, remember, U-turn, I'm not for the turning, this lady's not for turning, said Margaret Thatcher. But he was being criticized for changing his opinion. And he said, the honourable gentleman, that was the lovely term the British used for another member of parliament, the honourable gentleman may criticize me changing my mind, but when the facts change, I change my opinion. What does he do? So this is the point. You want to have expertise, encourage those experts to take a lead when there's decision making in their areas, but equally allow them to be part of your overall team where you have to make some difficult decisions. They may not know an awful lot about it, but the value of their input on areas outside their expertise would also be useful. So that's number 6, respect expertise. Make use of people's knowledge and experience and the years they've put into it. Number 7 of the 10, reframe the leader's role. David Marquet suggests leaders should act as facilitators who unlock the potential of their teams rather than being the one with all the answers. And I've seen this work really well, where the leader has a humility about himself or herself, and they go, do you know what? I don't know. What do you think? And they're okay with not knowing and not having to be the expert. There was a guy who will remain nameless, who was a very senior member of a very famous global bank that I was working with. And he thought he knew it all on every topic. And he'd do what he proudly called his deep dives, where he would go and visit huge chunks of the bank. But because he was such a bully and because he was trying to expect everybody to know everything about every topic, people who were prepared, they were frightened of him because he did fire people. People were prepared for 3 weeks beforehand. They were doing nothing else other than preparing for his visit. And that's a mistake. It's a misuse of things, which comes on to number 8, promote psychological safety. He created the exact opposite of that. It was a fear-based culture. No psychological safety there. People did not think well. I remember I worked for a senior general in the army, and he loved bullying people. People would be in fear of the man. And I may add, there's many more generals and senior officers who were very inspiring and were not like him. So this was, luckily, not many of these. But it was a fear-based culture. What you want instead is psychological safety. Culture where team members feel safe expressing their thoughts, their ideas, and their concerns. This will lead to better problem solving and innovation. But if you're in a fear-based culture and you feel your career is on the line, it's a bit like being an officer in the First World War. If you put your head above the parapet, you'll get it shot off and you'll die. So what do people learn to do? They learn to keep their head down. And in a fear-based culture, people keep their head down. And failure is not an option. You saw this in the disastrous situation in Lehman Brothers, where it's great if you're doing well, but if things were going bad, they didn't want to hear the bad news. And they would shoot the messenger. So no one would tell people. They'd just pretend everything was good. They'd even distort some of the graphs and charts, which warned of what's going on. So you've got to create psychological safety where you, as the leader, are prepared to be vulnerable, prepared to admit your mistakes. The last 2, valuing dissent and emphasize learning. Valuing dissent. Instead of dismissing dissenting opinions, see them as opportunities to understand different perspectives. This can lead to more robust solutions and decisions. So you want your team to disagree. They don't have to be disagreeable, disagree without being disagreeable, but you want diversity of thought as much as diversity of religion, sexual orientation, race, disability, variety of neurodiverse, whatever it might be. You want that kind of diversity, but you also want decision-making diversity. You don't want everybody to think just like you. You don't want everybody to be very analytical or very much storytelling, into the detail or into the big picture. You want a cross-section. And that's where something like Myers-Briggs was quite good, where you had extrovert, introvert, sensing, intuitive, thinking, feeling, and the SNTF, sensing, intuiting, thinking, feeling. You'd give the problem to those who sensed and saw the detail, and they'd pass across to those who were intuitive to see the patterns, who'd pass across to those who were deeply thinking about things and stuff, who'd then hand it across to people who thought about how would people feel about things. So you want to make sure you have this diversity of opinions, experience, and people can have dissent. And finally, this emphasizing learning. Encourage a culture of continuous learning. This not only keeps your skills and your knowledge up to date, but it also fosters curiosity and innovation, which is why Lee and I love the work of Nancy Klein and the thinking environment, because it allows everybody to speak. As General Jonathan Shaw, the Director of Special Forces, who I interviewed, said, good ideas have merit, not rank. So just because it's the boss's view doesn't mean it's the best one. And they've got to be humble enough to admit that they're not always the one with the answers. There's no monopoly on that. So that's just 10 of the great lessons in a story about a huge ship going into a storm in which everybody eventually dies, tragically, because they're not prepared to review and see review points when they can change course, but then they find themselves going into the eye of a storm, which affects everybody. So he uses good analogies, good stories, and he has lessons from his experience in the Navy. Enjoy, and good luck.